It's My Nerd World, a Star Wars show, and on this week's episode, have you ever heard of the EWOK line? This is a theory surrounding the Phantom Menace. I'll give you details on it. I find this really interesting, and I'd never heard of this before. Also, 1 week away, less than 1 week away from the debut of the Acolyte, and we already have controversy. I do not know why those in charge of Star Wars shows simply cannot avoid controversy and stirring it. It's unnecessary. I'll give you my thoughts. If you want to email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. Thank you so much for checking out this week's episode. Let's get to it.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you? I'm no one.
There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you. Just let it in.
And welcome to it. I'm your host, Jon Justice. Glad you are with another episode. As always, if you want to support My Nerd World and you like to read, I already know you like science fiction, I hope you will check out the science fiction space opera adventure series, EMBARK. 7 books in all in the series, available on Amazon.com. Just search for EMBARK, E-M-B-A-R-K, and Jon, Jon Justice, and you can check out my series, inspired by the storytelling of George Lucas, Ernie Klein, James Cameron. Really fun for all ages. And if you're new to the show, I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of this week's episode. I wish we could be talking about the stories. I wish we could be theorizing on the latest Star Wars content. We're not there yet. We're 1 week away from the debut of the latest entry into Star Wars canon, being The Acolyte, a show that takes place hundreds of years before the events of the Phantom Menace. New territory relating to live action that we've only been able to read about inside of the novels pertaining to the High Republic. I've gone back and forth in my enthusiasm about this show. Really excited at first, and then having that enthusiasm somewhat tempered based off of some things that I had heard prior to seeing the first trailer, and even some questions surrounding the first trailer. But generally speaking, I'm cautiously optimistic about what we could get with The Acolyte. Unfortunately, as happens with so much Disney content, controversy already erupts. And I wish we could be talking about the show, the storytelling. Again, we're not there yet. Instead, we have to talk about the latest issues to arrive surrounding a piece of Disney-related produced content.
When I found you, I saw raw, untamed power. And beyond that, something truly special.
There's a brand new New York Times article and an interview with Leslie Headland, the showrunner for The Acolyte. And in it, and I'll break this down, and I hope that you'll really listen to what I have to say regarding this controversy that's erupted, because I think it's part on the media for taking the conversation surrounding this new show in the direction that they did, but it's also partly on the individuals responsible for creating the Star Wars content. So we'll start here in this article, and I've pared it down for the sake of the show. Her new Star Wars show is a dream come true, but she knows it carries enormous expectations. I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared, said Leslie Headland. She's been telling Star Wars stories on screen since she was a teenager, ostracized at school for being different. She retreated inward, making stop-motion films starring her action figures. And so when she found success as an adult, Headland helped create Russian Doll, the 2019 Netflix comedy starring Natasha Lyonne, and got a chance to create an actual Star Wars show. It was the realization of a lifelong dream. And I think that's cool. I like that backstory. A lot of kids are ostracized in school and bullied. I was bullied in school. And she found a way to go and retreat to get away from that, and it was her love of Star Wars. And I'm always on board with somebody who's been a lifelong fan of Star Wars taking a crack at creating new Star Wars. All positive. And a chance for a humiliating failure on a galactic scale, she goes on to say, speaking to her fear of creating the show. I essentially cold called Lucasfilm, and after a lot of conversations, I found myself pitching a show. Utterly elated, my ultimate career goal, the culmination of my fandom. At the same time, I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared. There's so much pressure. It's extreme. I've never done anything this big before. Headland show, The Acolyte, debuting on June 4th, Disney+, costing roughly $180 million for 8 episodes. And I want to make a note of that. That's a significant chunk of change. I recently did a bonus podcast. It came out yesterday. If you missed it, go back and find it because it's probably been replaced with this show as it arrives on the same feed. But I did a quick review of the Netflix show Atlas, the movie Atlas, starring Jennifer Lopez, which I quite enjoyed. That movie, a 2-hour film, was $100 million. So they've spent more than that for these 8 episodes. It took 4 years to make. It attempts 2 feats at once, pleasing old-school Star Wars fans who can seem unpleasable while telling an entirely new story, one that acknowledges no prior knowledge of Star Wars and that showcases women and people of color. Okay, I have no problem with that, but this is where the media comes into play. Because it's not just the content creators and their responses, but it's the fact that the media goes down this particular road and feels it's necessary. And it's unnecessary, in my opinion. Their attempts to go and be diverse end up becoming very divisive because it's so tinged with the politics of the day that it can't help but cause a level of controversy. It's completely and totally unnecessary. And let me back up even further. This idea, too, of pleasing old-school Star Wars fans, I'm an old-school Star Wars fan. You don't go out of your way to please me. Just create good storytelling, relevant storytelling that makes sense. Now, I'll say up front, I don't mind politics being in Star Wars. I know that it's been there since the very beginning. It was influenced by the politics of its time, whether it's the original trilogy or the prequel trilogy, and the events that came before it. That being said, George Lucas did a very good job of embedding it within the story that didn't make it feel like you were being preached at. It was relevant. It was worthwhile. It wasn't there for just the sake of being there. It wasn't there, the politics, to just go and check off boxes. That's what happens now. There's like a list of boxes that need to be checked off. It doesn't happen organically. It doesn't happen authentically through the process of content creation. It comes out in the shows as checking off the boxes, making sure we're doing this, wedging it into the story. And when you do that, it becomes glaringly apparent at what you're doing. That's when it feels like you're being preached at. When it's awkward. When it's forced. Getting back to this article, the first Acolyte trailer, released March 3rd, racked up 51 million views first 24 hours, a record for any live-action series, including The Mandalorian, said Lucasfilm. Sneak peek footage released in theaters highlighted the show's unique martial arts sequences. Fan sites instantly deemed the fighting style of Force Fu. I hadn't heard that. But a loud primordial part of Star Wars fandom pushed back in a predictable fashion. Why are there so many women, girls, and minority characters increasingly dominating the ranks of the Jedi, reads a comment on the Acolyte trailer, with others expressing a similar worldview. Let's stop here. Why are you bringing attention to that? People have always had criticism, valid and ridiculous. Why are you drawing attention to it? This is where I have part of the issue. You can take the power away from commentary that you don't like by not granting it power in the first place. A comment in the comment section of a trailer's video only is granted power when you give it this type of attention. Now you've given that commentary that you don't appreciate a level of power. And be that as it may, I also understand why those questions are being raised. I don't personally have a problem with it. It's not a big deal to me. That being said, when there is such a fundamental shift, and it's being talked about right up front, especially by the content creators, then yes, people are going to notice, because you are saying we've intentionally gone and made these changes to be more inclusive, which inevitably, by the way, discriminates against other individuals that may be going and seeking those roles. And people rarely talk about that. And I don't like to get political on this show. It's a nature of what I do Monday through Friday on my radio show. But unfortunately, in total, what I'm talking about right now is tainting the quality of the products that are being put out relating to that galaxy far, far away that I love so much. It's an issue across the board that's completely avoidable if people would ignore a lot of this criticism and also stop trying to check so many boxes and just tell a good story. The article in the New York Times doesn't do that, though. They continue along these lines. It is a version of the same misogyny and racism that greeted Rey, the female Jedi who made her debut in The Force Awakens in 2015, that drove Kelly Marie Tran off of social media when she appeared in The Last Jedi. Kathleen Kennedy, who runs Lucasfilm, has also experienced it, with South Park harshly attacking her in an episode last year. The cartoon depicted Kennedy giving the same feedback to Star Wars creators over and over again. Put a chick in it, make her lame and gay. Now, what South Park did was incredibly over the top, but the reason why it was effective is because there was a level of truth in it. Some trolls have gone and nicknamed Headland's series the Wokalite. In a brief telephone interview, Kathleen Kennedy's support for the Acolyte was steadfast. My belief is that storytelling does need to be representative of all people, she said. That's an easy decision for me. Operating within these giant franchises now with social media and the level of expectation, it's terrifying. I think Leslie has struggled a little bit with it. I think a lot of women who step into Star Wars struggle with this a bit more because of the fan base being so male-dominated. They sometimes get attacked in ways that can be quite personal. Let me stop here for a second. Kathleen Kennedy doesn't know what she's talking about. And I'm not a Kathleen Kennedy hater by any stretch of the imagination. She's an incredible producer, has produced some of the most amazing pieces of content that I'm a huge fan of. I also don't feel like she's done a disservice to Star Wars. Unfortunately, she's fallen victim to the same sort of pressure that so many other corporations have relating to the the box checking that I mentioned earlier. And this idea of the fan base being male-dominated, she's clueless on that front. I'm a part of the fan base. Yes, I'm a male, but I can tell you firsthand from the conventions that I've gone to, from what I've watched the fandom, across the board in interviews, it's kind of a 50-50 split. This idea that somehow the Star Wars fandom is being male-dominated is it's a complete false narrative, in my opinion. The article goes on to say, Headland has tried to limit her exposure to online conversation, both good and bad, instead of relying on friends' weather reports. Okay. As a fan myself, I know how frustrating some Star Wars storytelling has been in the past. I'll get back to that. Headland said, declining to cite specific examples, she says, I've felt it myself. She followed up with a text message saying this, I stand by my empathy for Star Wars fans, she wrote, but I want to be clear. Anyone who engages in bigotry, racism, or hate speech, I don't consider a fan. That's where she screwed up. We don't live in a world anymore. The social sphere no longer has a clear definition for what is actual bigotry, racism, or hate speech. We used to, as a society, we could, by and large, together, the majority of people, could easily go and point to, that's hate speech, which is still free speech, by the way. That's racism, and that's bigotry. We can't do that as a society anymore. We can't come to form a consensus. You see, back then when we could form a consensus as to what bigotry, racism, and hate speech was, you don't need to make a statement like that. You don't have to say, I want to be clear, anyone who engages in bigotry, racism, or hate speech, I don't consider a fan. Because there was a consensus on what those things actually were when we saw them. Now, if you simply give your opinion on, say, a piece of, in this case, we'll be specific, a piece of Star Wars content relating to a female character being the lead, and you simply say, I wonder if that would have been better as a male role. We've had a lot of female-led shows as of late within Star Wars. I wonder if that would have been better as a male lead, just by example. Incredibly benign, in my opinion. People will go and say, that's bigotry. Criticism of a person of color acting skills, for example. Nothing relating to their identity whatsoever. Just simply the fact that there is criticism there and that person happens to be a person of color, people will call that racism even though it's not racism. The commentary that I've already provided here on the podcast this week, my criticism of political checking of the boxes, people would go and consider hate speech. This was a completely unnecessary thing to do ahead of the show. And now it has me wondering, what does she know that we don't know yet? Why would you make a statement like that up front? Unless there was an expectation that you've gone and included something in a piece of content that you already know is going to go and cause controversy. And why would that be the case? Because you perhaps included something in your show, not because it was genuine and authentic and relevant to the storytelling, but because it was injected in there for exactly what the article said earlier. Showcasing, pointing out, putting it up front in your face over representation, while you go and discriminate against other individuals who don't align with that particular representation. Again, this whole idea of diversity, inevitably, not a bad thing. If you're looking at this in terms of who's best qualified, meritocracy, looking at it from that angle. But unfortunately, that's not what happens with the diversity that we're dealing with today. Typically, it's more of the equity variety, where somebody else gets looked the other way and cast aside. Something that we had struggled with in the past in Hollywood and have made great, incredible strides to eliminate that, to make sure everybody has equal time, or there is equality relating to that representation. We've been doing great, but now it's gone a step further. It's really unfortunate, and it bums me out that I even feel compelled to go and talk about it on my show. I don't want to disenfranchise people, and I hope that if you are a newer listener to the show that you're really understanding what I'm saying. I don't have a problem with having a diverse Star Wars universe. I don't have a problem with female leads being in dominating so much of the Star Wars content. I think Kathleen Kennedy is wrong that the fandom is dominated by males. And for crying out loud, you go back to the original trilogy, and George Lucas has been very upfront and kind of pushed back a bit on this idea that there hasn't been enough in terms of females within Star Wars, especially the way that he created the Princess Leia character and how she was much stronger a personality and a character than Luke Skywalker was. He was whiny compared to Princess Leia. But guess what? Back then, we didn't care. It wasn't made a political issue. Nobody pointed to that. Why? Because it was genuine to the storytelling. Unfortunately, what we see now in too many circumstances is not genuine to the storytelling. It's so upfront and in your face that it's completely unavoidable, and it feels like you're being preached to. And I'm bummed that this galaxy far, far away that I do love so much, already less than a week out before the debut of the show that I'm looking forward to, and unfortunately, the media laid the trap. And as Snoke would say, the content creators here couldn't resist taking the bait. And now you have this as a point of conversation. Instead of speculating on what this show is going to entail and the stories that will unfold and what we've seen in the latest images posted in Empire magazine and the 30-second spots, we have the fans that are out there saying, if you have a problem with what Leslie Headland said, then you clearly are the people that she's speaking to and you're not a fan. It's not that cut and dry anymore. It simply isn't. And I'll say it again one more time for those in the back. We used to be able to come to a consensus as a society of what bigotry, racism, and hate speech was and is. And at that point in time, you never need to go and make a statement like Leslie Headland said. But you make a statement like that now, and the consensus is those are broad terms that can apply to a wide range of criticism that some people go and label as hate speech, racism, and bigotry, but is anything but. And one last thing, and this is disappointing. I don't know whether it's the New York Times not following up on this question of Leslie Headland or the fact that she just didn't want to respond. But saying, as a fan myself, I know how frustrating some Star Wars storytelling has been in the past, declining to cite specific examples. I felt it myself. I'd be very interested to know what she is talking about. Not everything needs to represent you. Because you know what? When characters are written well, the identity politics don't matter anymore. You relate to the characters because of the human experience, regardless of their skin color. Which is why, for a lot of the projects, I don't have a problem with. Jyn Erso? No problem. Rey? No problem. One of my favorite characters in Star Wars. Ahsoka? Sabine? No problem. I'm not a woman by any stretch. Even though I may act like one sometimes. No, listen. We relate to individuals on a human level. Our emotions that we all share, regardless of the color of your skin. Regardless if you're a man, a biological man, or a biological woman. That's how you relate to people, not because of their identity. And this is what gets lost so many times. Now, Leslie Headland's allowed to feel whatever she wants to feel. I just find it unfortunate that if she had problems with Star Wars storytelling in the past, one, I'd be very curious what those problems were, and two, I would like to know with that exactly why she felt as if there wasn't proper representation or what she had an issue with. I mean, I'm trying to think of... Well, I won't even go that way. Again, I don't typically like to get this political on the show, but this has been a part of the conversation because of the fact that the media decides to go there, and the content creators just simply can't avoid not making comments about it.
We have a spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
All right, let's get to something on a little bit of a lighter note. Still talking about the ugly side of fandom, but a theory that I hadn't heard before that I found rather interesting. This comes from Melanie McFarland, a lengthy piece written in Yahoo. And again, for the sake of the show, I've edited this down. Melanie writes, 25 years onward from the theatrical debut of Star Wars Episode I, The Phantom Menace, nearly every one of its haters has a story about how George Lucas wrecked their childhood. Then she gets into talking about The Phantom Menace. The bulk of The Phantom Menace and its silver anniversary coverage breaks down to measuring how we feel about The Phantom Menace all these years later, as opposed to appreciating what it contributes to the movie making or the franchise canon. Okay? Our love or hate frequently boils down to what age were we in 1999? Less often examined is the mechanics of Star Wars as a brand, with the emotional staying power and Gen X's insidiously possessive attitude concerning the original trilogy. This existed long before Lucas wrote and directed The Phantom Menace. The 25th anniversary of The Phantom Menace coincides with the 41st anniversary of a fictionally established but sound theory, first presented by Neil Patrick Harris's character, Barney Stinson, in a 7th season episode of How I Met Your Mother called Field Trip, that first aired in 2011. It's called the EWOK line, a demographic border established on May 25th of 1983. Those who turned 10 before that date were too old for something so cloying and cute, said Barney. Anyone who turned 10 afterward loves the Ewoks because why? They reminded you of your teddy bears. Now, I turned 11 that year in July. I personally did not have a huge problem with The Phantom Menace, so I guess I kind of am a bit of an anomaly relating to the EWOK line. Again, for someone who turned 10 before that date, okay, they were too old for something cute like Ewoks. But if you turn 10 after, you like the Ewoks because they were geared towards you. Writer Jamie Ronheimer verbalized the source of the first schism within the Star Wars congregation. The EWOK line solidifies a generational quirk that many 30 to 40-somethings didn't recognize as a commonality. Regarding Star Wars, it was the smaller fault line that predicted the chasm created when the people who waited for a full driver's licensed teenager's existence for a new Star Wars chapter were greeted by Jake Lloyd listlessly yelling, "Yippee!" Of course, he would go and play Anakin Skywalker. Melanie goes on to say, "Today I can better appreciate that Lucas didn't make those films for me. He made them for the 1999's children." And Lucas has always said this. As such, the love/hate division has become less binary as the franchise's mythology has expanded and we've all matured. Now, this also explains what I refer to in some cases, the overboard love of Andor. Those saying it's the best Star Wars ever. Well, why do they say that? Because I think if you go off of the EWOK line, right, and those who were 10 years old afterwards, they didn't like the teddy bears, they didn't like what George Lucas did in The Phantom Menace, and they wanted a more mature Star Wars, because Star Wars is what you make it. Ultimately, despite my criticism in the first part of the podcast, I've been able to look past a lot of what we're talking about. And more specifically, the criticism that I typically have for Star Wars is more based off of the production quality and sometimes the writing and the film's directing, and less about the injection of content that's in your face and not done more naturally. I am pretty good at looking past a lot of those things, and in my view, Star Wars hasn't been overly egregious in injecting that yet, which is, again, gives me cause for concern for the Acolyte coming out. But Star Wars is what you make it. Andor, I enjoyed it. I've done a second watch on it. I know there are people that listen to this podcast that absolutely think it's awesome and think that's great. It's all subjective. You can believe whatever you want to believe, and that belief and what you enjoy is not wrong because you love it for what it is. I tend to find Andor a bit on the boring side. I like the fantasy element. I like a little bit more action. I don't need it to be super, super serious. I like to have a good time. I like to have fun. I'm also a person that also likes The Rise of Skywalker a lot. So what does that say? Getting back to the article, if people feel better than we once did about the prequels, you can credit Dave Filoni's contributions to the Star Wars mythos by way of the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels. That acclaimed pair of animated series thoughtfully filled in the gaping potholes left between the prequels and fleshed out Anakin Skywalker's backstory and psychological profile. Thanks to them, old-school devotees have a respectable consolation prize to enjoy with their childhood and grandchildren. And listen, I don't disagree with that. I think that The context that the Clone Wars and Rebels have brought to the prequels has been fantastic. I've mentioned on the show many times that I love how the additional content that we get ends up amplifying existing content. I dig it when that happens. I do want to say, though, the original trilogy wasn't fleshed out, and we didn't care. I mean, when you go back to the prequels when they were released, we didn't know a lot about the prequels. We still didn't know where Palpatine, truly came from at the time, but we didn't care. When we watched the original trilogy, there was a magic to the fact that we'd been dropped into this universe that we could instantly go and relate to based off of George Lucas and his desire to create this lived-in universe. It had a tactile way about it, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in just a moment, where it was immediately accessible. You didn't need to know how the spaceships flew. You just knew they were able to fly. Looking at them and based off of the way that they were created, it made mental sense to you. The characters were relatable, not because of their identity, but because of the experiences that they went through that we could relate to. The hero's journey is exactly that. The hero's journey works when it's done correctly, regardless of the individual who is going on the hero's journey. The hero's journey doesn't work because of the individual's identity. The hero's journey works because these are experiences that we can all, as human beings, relate to. Several essayists have described common characteristics of the Star Wars generation in terms of its existence at a technological turning point. Remember, having to physically dial phone numbers using devices that plugged into walls, or when only a handful of movies came out each summer. The pioneering special effects Lucas used in A New Hope are part of those expectations. So were the action figures. The disenchanted devotees' teddy bears. And again, a bit of a tangent on this, but it's compelling nonetheless. The flying of the Falcon, the turning off of the targeting computer in Luke's X-Wing. We could relate that, and I still do, to when I get in my car. Turning on the air conditioner, turning on the automobile, releasing the emergency brake. When Luke is in the X-Wing fighter, they're pushing buttons. When Han is slapping at the gauges inside the Millennium Falcon. These are all things that you could relate to. Even in modern day, with technology advancing beyond the analog to the digital, the idea of R2-D2 or any droid plugging into a wall socket still makes all the sense in the world, whether you're plugging something into a wall or you've got a USB that you're plugging into your computer. Our disappointment may also be a function of the consumption, of movie consumption evolving as well. Those feelings over ownership with Star Wars probably have something to do with the fact that we actually own copies of the original movies on VHS. Home video systems enabled superfans to rewatch the confrontation between Han Solo and Greedo repeatedly to determine who shot first. Listen, my still current love of physical media, even beyond its streaming's visual limitations, I like to have physical copies of my media. That also meant we could pick apart the smallest details about each scene and amplify some sense of profundity that, truth be told, probably wasn't there in the first place. The man who gave the role of Queen Amidala to Natalie Portman, an actor who went on to win a Best Actress Oscar, who doled down her abilities to the level, the article writer says, of a taxidermed fish puppetry. Disagree with that. But you know who wasn't scrutinizing Portman or Liam Neeson or Samuel L. Jackson for emotional range? People born on the post-83 side of the EWOK line. Many Phantom Menace lovers embrace it as the first Star Wars that they saw in theaters, when they were as close to Padme Amidala's age of 14 or Anakin's at 9 years old. Those folks loved the pod racing scene and the fact that a boy, Anakin, saves the day by, in effect, hitting the off switch on a massive remote. Most embraced the silliness of Jar Jar as opposed to expanding on his clumsy slapstick into something more sinister than his maker intended. Did critics misjudge their cinematic worth back then from a canonical perspective? Perhaps. In 2024, we're awash in Star Wars stories, some better than others, the article writer says, thanks to the seeds that Lucas planted in those prequels. By the way, I never understood, and they get into a bit of this here, I never understood when it came to the stereotyping and the voices within Star Wars, I always got what George Lucas was trying to do. He was trying to, again, make it relatable. These are alien species based off of real-world people, and sometimes real-world people sound that way. There's nothing racist about that. It's part of the human experience and making these situations relatable. I never understood that criticism. And it's probably why Star Wars never went the route in the original trilogy did of getting canceled. Like, oftentimes, if something is over the top and truly egregious, and it tries to go and get canceled, if it really is, then typically it gets canceled. But if something is attempted to be canceled or looked at as being a particular way, whether it falls into the category of what I mentioned earlier of bigotry, racism, or hate speech, typically it remains. If it really isn't that and it's just a select minority in size group of individuals who have determined that's the case because they've made that choice, not because it actually stems from reality. In terms of their overall execution to the new Star Wars stories, the author says, they're still really, really not good, she writes. That said, not every critic bludgeoned the Phantom Menace. It's funny that she says that, though. Not really, really not good, when the whole article is laying out that, again, it's all a matter of subjectivity. In some cases, it's age. In other cases, it's just a matter of, I don't have a problem with that. I never had a huge issue with Jar Jar. He was goofy. I knew it was made for kids. But when I watched the re-release a few weeks back, I was laughing at Jar Jar. So was my 17-year-old. So, at the risk of offending devotees of the Force, I will say that the stories of the Star Wars movies have always been space operas, and that the importance of the movies comes from their energy, their sense of fun, their colorful inventions, and their state-of-the-art special effects. Some of them were cuddly and meant to be kid-friendly. That doesn't exempt them from disdain or criticism, but maybe all these years later, we naysayers might observe more closely which side of the line we stand on and what that position says about us. It's a really good point there at the end of this piece. Doesn't exempt them from disdain or criticism, but maybe all these years later, we naysayers might observe more closely which side of the line we stand on and what that position says about us. Again, Star Wars is what you make it. And that's simply another way of saying it's subjective in that regard, as is almost all entertainment being subjective in that regard. I really hope The Acolyte is good. I hope that my concerns, based off of recent commentary, are unfounded, and that the show is genuine to the storytelling, and that regardless of any checking of boxes to meet certain standards that society has deemed we need to make in all of our content these days, that it doesn't matter. The writing is solid, the story is good, and that is dispensed with, and I don't feel like I'm being preached at. I'm cautiously optimistic. Thank you so much for checking out the episode this week. Again, if you'd like to support my nerd world, or if you just want to dive into some space opera outside of the Star Wars universe, I hope you'll check out my science fiction series, EMBARK. I originally wrote it because of my love of Star Wars. I wanted to know what it was like to create my own universe, not wanting to duplicate what George Lucas did, but simply being inspired by it. I chose to tell my story starting off on Earth in the year 2172. The first story is really a mashup of the genres that I love: science fiction, space opera, apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic stories as well, with pop culture, inspired in part by Ready Player One and Ernie Klein, book one at least, that I really, truly love. I wrote these stories for adults, but like Star Wars, I wanted to make them accessible for kids as well, so ages 11 plus completely appropriate, and I've had those, 11-year-olds to 80-year-olds read my books and enjoy them equally. So, the book one description is as follows. Katha's father died 1 year ago. Yesterday, he gave her the key to saving humanity. She just doesn't know it yet. With interstellar travel possible, pilots are the future. And since the mysterious passing of her father, Keith Morrow has relentlessly trained to be the best. But when an industrial accident sets off an apocalyptic chain of events, she'll need more than her skills to survive. Meanwhile, Taft Guardia picked the right day to upgrade his ship when Keitha arrived needing his help after his help investigating a cryptic message she suddenly received. As a tyrannical enemy emerges to ruthlessly exploit the disaster, Keitha and Taft discover what might be the only chance of ending the conflict. On the run across the galaxy, Taft gathers a ragtag squadron to join the fight, while Keitha must solve the mystery of what her father left behind if there is any hope of saving Earth's evacuees before it's too late. Don't miss this fast-paced, action-packed, epic science fiction adventure series. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with sci-fi. You can buy EMBARK Book 1 today on Amazon.com, as well as the entire complete series, all 7 books, in ebook, free on Kindle Unlimited, hardcover, paperback, and audiobook. Again, if you like your science fiction space opera to be epic, filled with really cool technology, romance, and action, EMBARK is perfect for you. If you love Star Wars, EMBARK is perfect for you. Go to Amazon.com and search for Jon, Jon Justice, to pick up your preferred copy today. Thank you so much for checking out this week's episode. I hope wherever you are happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. We'll talk about the Acolyte next week. Here's hoping. We'll talk to you then. God bless. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.